Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's OUP webinar. This time talking with two startup CEOs who started their founder experience as grad students. I'm really happy to have you all here today on the heels of our webinar last week, which was on financing trends in startups. I'm Kirsten Leute of Osage University Partners. I'm going to be your moderator today. And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to show that we have two fabulous founders here to talk with us today. I'll have them each briefly introduce themselves. We'll have them go more into their stories as we ask them questions through our Q&A. So Shelley, I'll start with you. Could you just give us a 30-second introduction? Not 30 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm Shelley Force Aldred. I'm a scientist by training, earned my PhD in genetics from Stanford. And then I say I'm a serial entrepreneur by learning everything the hard way. So I spun my first company out of Stanford back in 2006, where I got to know Kirsten because she was my OTL liaison. Currently, I'm co-founder and CEO of Rondo Therapeutics. I started the company in my study all by myself in early 2020 with an idea on paper. Now we're well-funded, 23 people, and should be treating our first patients by the end of the year.
Well, congratulations, Shelley.
Thank you.
Laura.
Hello, I'm Laura Schewel. I got my PhD from UC Berkeley in energy and resources and spun my company StreetLight Data out of that experience, funded by OUP and others. We are in the software space, so we develop specially big data and data science-based analytics for the transportation industry. And we have been around for 14 years and were acquired 3 years ago by Jacobs Engineering Group. So now I run StreetLight as part of Jacobs, and I also do other things for Jacobs as well.
Great. Yes, and so proud to have been investors in StreetLight. And terrific to have this relationship that I already have with both of you, and now have you come on and talk with people about your experiences as initial founders, as grad students. We will get to that in just a bit, but we're first going to go through some logistics. So next slide. A recording of this webinar will be available via OUP's partner portal, and a recording will also be publicly available via our YouTube channel. If you do have access to our partner portal, you know where you can find these resources. I go through this each time when we do our webinars. For everyone else, you have access through the YouTube channel. We have the URL on here. You can subscribe to that to receive notices when we post new webinars on that channel as well. We will be sending out recording of this. I think it'll be actually next week rather than later this week. It could be possibly tomorrow. Just kind of depends on how quickly we are able to do that. You can find access to these also through the QR codes that we've noted at the bottom as well. We will have more information on upcoming webinars coming soon. We have some in the works. We do, and for this particular webinar, I do want to mention that we encourage questions throughout our webinars. Please use the Q&A tool that is at the bottom, at least it's the bottom of my Zoom, to ask your questions. Please don't put them in the chat. It's much harder for me to track them if you put them in the chat. So please put them in the Q&A, and I will be reviewing those as we go along. We did receive a number of questions beforehand, honestly, dozens of questions beforehand, and we worked those into the questions we already have prepared for our speakers today. So we'll go to the next slide. We do want to do a short intro on IUP for those of you who don't know us. We're a venture capital fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising participation rights available through their licenses. For those of you who don't know what participation rights are, they are the ability to invest in future rounds of a company on the same terms and conditions as other investors. We do have recommended language on participation rights for institutions if you don't currently use those. As part of our partnership with academic institutions, they share in our profits and receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups. We're now on our fourth fund. I'm very proud of that. We've made investments in over 150 different companies in all areas of deep sciences, with many of those companies then going on to successful exits. And the next slide shows you just a smattering, a sampling of those particular companies that we've invested in. So you can see we have both a life sciences team that invests as well as a physical sciences team investing a broad number of areas. So with that, we will go to the next slide, which is just saying that we're going to have a Q&A today. So we're not going to have slides. We're just going to be talking with our fabulous founders here. So we'll take down the slides for now and go on to the purpose of this webinar, which is to hear about their stories. So I'm going to have each of you talk about the founding of your first startup, where in your graduate student life you started this startup, where did you have that initial inkling that you wanted to do a startup, what were the events that led you to pursue the startup, and provide a description of how that actually happened. And Laura, I will start with you.
Sure. So I was in grad school. I was working on transportation sustainability, and I was working on transportation sustainability. I had been in the working world for about 3 years before going back to grad school, working for the federal government, working for environmental nonprofits. So I knew this transportation and sustainability and climate change was my thing. But as most of y'all grad students know, the way you win a PhD is you get data that no one else has and analyze it. So this was, and I know this is going to blow your minds, right when iPhones had just come out and were getting popular. And iPhones started to have the ability to run multiple apps at once, called backgrounding. This was new, and Androids caught up soon after. So at the same time, I knew, because of my background in the field, that part of the problem with making sustainable transitions in transportation is nobody knew much about transportation. It was very unmeasured. So I thought, hey, these are these little GPS devices. Like, maybe I could get a couple hundred people to like carry them around and collect data about how they move. That was basically the idea. And through a series of unexpected events, including the California financial crisis and us having to get really creative on funding because a lot of federal funding and state funding went away, which may be something you are experiencing right now. I entered a business plan competition at the business school, which I was not a part of, just to win the cash prize with a fake businessy version of my PhD idea so I could fund the lab for the summer. And won and got, I don't know, it was like $40,000. I was like, oh my God, that's so much money. But that sort of faking it out move set me on this path where, you know, it was sort of interesting. And then I took a class in clean tech entrepreneurialism at the business school because I met all these people, and eventually some people who I'd worked with followed up with me, and several people were like, that's not a bad idea. You might want to consider it. And so for various reasons, I did consider it. I took a summer off to see what it would be like to have a startup. And that was a long time ago, and I didn't stop. That's basically the story. Anything
That's
else
awesome.
important?
I love it. I love it. So such a great origin story. And I think that's so true for so many. It's kind of almost happenstance. Where and serendipity comes along and it works out well. So that's a great story. All right, Laura, sorry, Shelley, your story.
All right. So by way of a little bit of background, I grew up in a house with a dad who was building his own company. So I think I came from a bit of an entrepreneurial mindset, totally different field, real estate investment management. But I kind of saw what that was like. And so I think I always had in the back of my mind that it would be fun to start a company someday. But when I started grad school, I was very sure that I wanted to be a professor. And I hadn't really thought down the road to how those things might come together. Like many people, I got about 3 years into grad school and realized I did not want to be a professor, and then had a bit of an existential crisis. You know, I actually ended up taking like a quarter off of grad school to explore other things and try to figure out what was going to light a fire under me, and explored a lot of things: educational outreach, lecturing, going into industry, talked to as many people as I could. But then I had a bit of an opportunity that let me push off that decision a bit. So I'm fortunate that I kind of grew up scientifically in a very well-funded lab at Stanford, closely associated with the Human Genome Project. And so at the end of my grad school tenure, I helped write a really big, $11 million grant for the ENCODE project, which was like the second phase of the Human Genome Project. And fortunately for me and one of my grad school classmates who wasn't sure what he wanted to do either, there were aspects of that were technology development, like research tools development for the consortium, that were not really good for grad student or postdocs. And so we were both able to stay on as scientists in the lab for a little while after and kind of build out some of these technologies. And, giving you a little preview, this friend, Nathan, who, was in the same boat as me, has now been my co-founder on 4 companies, and we still work together. So all of those things come together. We still hadn't really hatched the plan about a company But I remember going to one very memorable consortium meeting out at the NIH where we were presenting on these research tools we'd be creating to kind of share with people in the consortium, and had a bunch of people that I didn't even think would want access to these tools come up and say, we really want these tools. Very briefly, this was early in kind of genome mapping, and we had cloned thousands of human promoters upstream of like a reporter gene that you could use for high throughput cell-based assays to track like activation of different biological pathways. So I remember flying home, sit next to each other on the plane. I don't even remember who started the conversation. It was like, wow, if there's that much interest, maybe there's actually a commercial opportunity here. Like, would it be crazy to think about doing a startup? You know, this was 2005. And I knew it was the right thing for me to at least try, because it was by far the most excited I had felt about my career in years. Like, it just completely lit that fire that I was looking for, which was good because it's really, really hard and you need that fire. So, you know, we went back, super fortunate that our PI at Stanford, Rick Myers, was very supportive, 100% behind us. You know, what can I do? So the first thing we attempted to do was write a big SBIR grant, which we did not get. And I should have saved the letter because it says like team shows no indication of being able to do the work, or whatever that discouraging thing was. So we pivoted to trying to raise angel money. That early venture capitalists were not kind of interested. And this is where just feeding the network of Stanford alums and who they knew, we eventually found a kind of older, very successful biotech entrepreneur that knew our PI, who just said, you know, I like the fire in your eyes, I'll invest $250,000. And so we both quit our jobs, because at that point, $250,000 seemed like a reason that two people should quit their jobs. We spent the next couple of months then essentially raising about $1 million of angel money to just start the company, figure out our business model. That took us in about 2 years. You know, we eventually ended up patenting and inventing our own reporter gene. We cloned 70,000 regulatory elements from the human genome, their products. But once we figured out kind of our business model with $1 million, we raised about $3.5 million of venture money from one venture firm. And we could raise a relatively low amount because we did have revenue all the way along. So we ended up building up the company for about 6 years. You know, had 100,000 SKUs, had 1,000 customers, academia and industry, had reached cash flow break even. And then came the hard decision, because this was where I learned the challenge of trying to build company growth in a small market, which is revenue kind of levels off. So we had two choices. We could either bring in more investment and bring in more technology to expand our reach, which our investors were supportive of, or we could sell to somebody else. And it was a tough decision, but I could say for me, I learned the next company I wanted to be closer to patients, and I wanted to be in a bigger market. So we made the decision to sell, which the investors weren't super happy about, but we did it anyway. So we did manage to sell it, a fairly positive exit, to be candid. Like, we got everybody their money back and just a little bit more. And I was kind of crushed at the time, because you have all these dreams of what your first startup is going to be like. Looking back, I'm incredibly proud of what we pulled off, almost by sheer force of will. And I realize now that that experience basically taught me how to build a company, and that that's what I really love to do. So that was a little bit longer than it was. Sorry, but there you go. There's the Odyssey.
Yeah. Well, and you touched actually a little bit on our next question there, Shelley, which was, what was it like for you to make the switch from academia to a new venture? What kind of skills did you, new skills did you need, and how did you acquire those, and what transferred well? And Shelley, I'll start with you and then go to Laura.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's exciting and terrifying all at once, which is, I've realized what keeps me engaged in my job. As soon as I'm not excited and terrified, then I'm kind of bored. So I like that part. For the scientific part, building a small company wasn't that much of a leap. It was like building a small research lab in a lot of different ways. I think the stretches came with respect to operations, fundraising, finance, managing people, all of those things. And the things that transferred to me were scientific, logical, rigorous thinking and planning, execution, and that I had a pretty good natural set of people skills that transferred well. Everything else I had to learn. And I'll say one thing that I learned for myself was that I'm not spectacularly good at any one thing, but I'm pretty good at a lot of things, right? Like I have a pretty good head for finance. I'm a pretty good communicator. I'm an okay scientist, but all those things really came together to work for the job I had. So all of those other things I had to learn through a combination of finding mentors, relying on early kind of board members and investors and their advice. Having a business partner was super helpful because you could kind of divide and conquer. And then I definitely also, relied on my dad, though it was a different industry. He had built a company. So it was, you cannot be afraid to ask for help and input. There's no class I could have taken. I'll just preface it with that.
All right. Laura, same question.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. By the way, I totally resonate with the realizing that maybe I didn't want to be a professor after all was part of this percolation in the back of my mind, and the random guy who gave us $250,000 to get started. So I think that good PhD students are often entrepreneurial. There's lots of different types of PhDs, and some are sort of working through a lab structure that's very guided, but many are just like, I don't know, figure it out and write something transformational, which is a very entrepreneurial energy. Also, at least at Berkeley, which was not well funded back then, you had to be entrepreneurial just to get anything done. So there's a little bit of overlap in the like, I'm going to do something no one else did. And there's no, I think one of the hardest things about transitioning is like, it's hard to know what the success path is. Like if you're in this grad school, they're like, oh, you published, and da, 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 da. You're like, okay. And like when you're starting the company, it's like, okay, you get funding and you get Series A, but then you get into these hard questions about like, do I want to grow the company? Do I want to sell the company? Do I care about the, like, it's a much vaguer career path to be an entrepreneur. So getting comfort with that, getting intensely comfortable with rejection is tough because a lot of people who end up in grad school are very smart and have been very successful. And like every time you fill in a homework, you get like an A+. Rejection every day, constantly from investors, from clients. One of the things that I found the most infuriating was just like my social group was like, oh, you have a little startup. Are you guys like in a garage? And I'm like, no, it's serious. But just constant rejection and not letting it bother you. That's a really important skill. In terms of the skills of like how to pitch a company well, how to present it well, how to like, learn like what is a Series A and what is an option and all that kind of stuff. I agree. I don't think there's a class. Like you can take a class and it can like familiarize you a little bit, but that's not it, right? You have to learn by doing it and screwing up and looking at other successful examples and trying to copy and adapt them.
Great.
Yeah, those are my takes. So what yeah.
Well, so I was going to ask you next about any programs you guys might have participated in, but I'm not sure I should be asking that question.
I mean, I did. I took one course at Haas, which was good.
Yeah.
Concept to market. Good. I mean, they did a good job. They made it, and they were good. They did a practicum. Like we had to pitch a fake product, like it got me familiar with the vocabulary.
Yeah.
That was like a very small part of learning.
So I will second what Laura just said is, in keeping context, this was 2005, right? So even at Stanford, that was pretty far ahead on these things. There weren't very many internal programs. And I did take one seminar series course at the business school. And again, I agree. I think I learned some of the language, but not much past that. And I will say I sent somebody an email this morning because I'm closely affiliated with Stanford still, and they have all these entrepreneurial programs now. Like it's just remarkable what's out there. But I still get people all the time saying, okay, I took this business school class, but like they don't know how I do X. Like the really not sexy parts of starting something up. Like how do I find a lawyer? Like, how do I find space? What do I do for HR? How do I manage finance? He's really not. So even with all of these explosions of these entrepreneurship programs, there's still a huge need to be networking with people who have actually done it.
Like, for example, if I was hiring someone for a business growth role and they'd come out and their training was that program, I would count it at about like 0% of experience.
Totally.
All right. I love it. Okay. A question from the audience that just came in. I want to know how long it took to start the startups and what were some of the hard questions you needed to answer before setting them up. And Laura, I'll start with you on that one. So how long from kind of well, yours was a kind of like, hey, this actually could work, kind of serendipitously happened, but how long before you actually like felt like you had a startup?
Oh, years.
Yeah.
Like a couple of years. So it was because I was still in grad school and we didn't know, and there was no money. Like I didn't make a salary for like, I don't know, 4 or 5, like a long time. So it was like a project and we would test and test and test and develop and develop and develop. And I felt like it was eventually it was me plus 2 others who were also working essentially part-time. It took us maybe we got our seed funding from an acquaintance I had, an angel investor from an earlier job. I don't think I felt like I had a startup then, I had a project. I felt like I had a startup when we got our Series A, which was maybe 2.5 years later, and we had sold something to a client. I mean, we duct taped. This is very different than medical. You can't just sort of like duct tape something together in a medical startup, but in a software startup, you can. Duct tape, metaphorically speaking. We'd sold it twice and like could conceive of our business model. But when I look back at what we were pitching in that era, it's completely different from what we evolved to.
Really
So
great.
like, we didn't know, I didn't feel like we had StreetLight, which became a scalable business model that made money and got sold for a lot of money and employed a lot of people and does all this, it wasn't a business for probably till our Series B, which was 4 years later. So it takes a long time. And again, I'm speaking very specifically from the angle of, and I should have said this, software for businesses, enterprise software. There are very different life cycles in medical and in consumer software and in consumer goods. So like the lessons and the timeframes I learned are not consistent. So it's relevant to not like the market, but the big category of what it is you're building.
Yeah, and I would say from, hatching the idea on the plane to that first angel money and trying to find some space was probably a year or a little bit more, which was actually pretty fast. But similar experience that it took us that first $1 million in a year and a half, almost 2 years to actually figure out what our business model was. You thought you knew what it was, and then it's completely different, but that's an entirely normal experience.
Well, next question then is about the people who helped you along the way. Would love to hear about how you connected with those people, what they provided you. I mean, we're talking about mentors here, but also people who just kind of introduce you to people. Who were the people who did help you along the way, and how did you find them? Shelley, I'll start with you.
So I think I mentioned, having my dad, having a business partner, those things were great. Early investors and early board members were all incredibly helpful because they were invested and they wanted you to have success. But I'd say the primary resource for me in a broad sense was a network I kind of built, starting with Stanford alums and then kind of built from there. So when I was still in academia, I just went around and asked all the professors in my department, what former students or postdocs do you know had started companies before, and can you introduce me to them? And then you meet them, and each of those people, you say, hey, this was great to meet you. I appreciate it. Or there are a couple of other people in your network that would be useful for me to talk to. And you kind of build this tree of people to the point that there are people I'm really close to now that I don't even remember the chain of events like that brought me to them. So the advice I give is just ask somebody to have coffee and share their experiences with you. Like the worst they can do is say no. And I've had so few people say no. People have been so generous with their time. So my advice is basically talk to anyone who will talk to you and just hear about their experience. It might not be immediately relevant, but that's okay. They'll know other people. It could be relevant 3 years from now. Just go have coffee or lunch with anyone who will make time for you.
Laura.
Yeah, it's good advice. I wasn't as good about the alumni thing. So from my first few investors were the most important people, right? It took me a while to get to them, but pitching to them, and then
How
once
did
they
you, can
finally
I ask
got
how
invested.
you got to them too?
Yeah, so my first angel investor had been the board member of the nonprofit I worked at before I went back to grad school. And I was talking to my old boss. I was like, I don't know, maybe I want to start this company. Like, it's a thing. I'm in the Bay Area. That could be like a thing to do for a little bit. He's like, the board member, whose name is Ruben, said, after you presented, he thought you were brilliant and he would love to follow up with your career and he invests. And I was like, okay. So I had breakfast with him when he was in town and got money. So old prior work connections. And then there are also a lot of people, especially in the Valley, Silicon Valley area, that will take advantage of you. And sometimes that's okay. It's a quid pro quo. Like there's a lot of people who, if you get that seed money, you can pay them $50,000 and they'll like improve your pitch deck and make networking for you. I'd say no, it's tempting. I met one or two good people that way, but no. But there's a lot of that. So then, God, how did I do this? Yeah, I just started cold calling investor people. Honestly, for a while, based on advice I got, I was the chief technology officer or something, and there was a different CEO who was an experienced multi-time investor or older guy. Like, you need someone with gray hair, like you know, no one's gonna take you seriously. You're just a grad student. You've never done this before. So for like a year and a half, that person was the CEO, who was not a bad person and didn't do a terrible job, but didn't do a great job either. And it was clear that my co-founder and I had a lot more passion and a lot more drive. And eventually I became the CEO after that first 10 months and stayed the CEO till today. So that was another like mistake I made on the way. But at the same time, I don't think it's a mistake for everyone because lots of technical founders are not good CEOs, even though they're very passionate. So I think that's something to be very careful about. And I was lucky in finding a good technical partner who it wasn't his first startup, Paul, my co-founder, it was his fourth startup. So that relationship with Paul, even though he was a technical guy, like didn't want to interact with humans a lot, like all that kind of classic stuff, he knew enough, he sort of had that. So it was that balance. Like you want someone who's done it before and you want to be humble about where your actual skills lie. And being the CEO is a very specific personality type. But eventually through Paul, we met a lot of our technical team, and then through just cold calling and begging, we met the investor network. We quickly sort of identified ourselves in the clean energy space, and there's a very specific investor pool around that space. And then eventually through Berkeley, we met Osage, and my Osage investor partner, Mark, checked it. We were too early, but he checked in and mentored and introduced me along the way that led up to their investment in StreetLight a couple of years later. So that was also the our university's basically tech transfer office was also valuable.
All right, next question. We're going to move on to income. And you both talked about kind of your initial fundings in that you had into your ideas, but sometimes there is an income gap that happens between being a grad student and starting the founding the startup and starting to get income from the startup. How did you handle the gap of being a grad student, going to the startup, and how did you then also cover the initial costs of founding the company itself? And Laura, I'll start with you.
So you should if you go into this, you should have the assumption that it will fail and you will not make a penny, because I don't know what this is, 95% odds that will happen no matter how good it doesn't matter how good your idea is, right? It does not matter how good your idea is. You will fail. That is how you should go in. And if you truly cannot afford that and it will affect your life in a really problematic way, you shouldn't do it. Because not only because then you'll have a problem, but also it affects your decision making if you're financially desperate right? You don't make wise or thoughtful decisions if you're that strung out personally as well as professionally, in my experience. And in my experience, watching a lot of other people be like, well, I just got this extra mortgage and blah, 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 blah. And I'm just like, oh God, no. Like, and then it spirals fast. So, and this is not fair and it's not good. And it's one of the reasons that a lot of founders come from wealthier families. And that's just true. So I had saved up a bit from my working years, in between school, and I knew I could live in the Bay Area cheaply because I've been on a grad student fellowship at Berkeley for a few years. And I was still a student, so I had healthcare covered by Berkeley for the first few years. So that's one thing I did was splitting, and then we'll have an IP conversation about how you manage that splitting. But that covered healthcare, which was basically an important thing for me. But yeah, I just ate through my savings, and I knew for myself financially that if everything blew up, my parents could pay my rent for 6 months while I re-enrolled or got a job, and I could pay them back eventually.
Yeah. So I was very fortunate in retrospect because my PI was super supportive, and he pretty much let us continue as scientists like during the day, right? And then nights and weekends we're trying to get this company off the ground. So
Yeah.
I didn't actually really have, I'll say I didn't have a salary gap, but the salary levels were as low as they could possibly be and survive, because that's not how you want to burn kind of all your startup money. But I wasn't faced with a stretch of zero. Having a spouse who was working helped a lot. And I was in a similar place with Laura, that while I did not want to take money from my family, if I got really desperate and needed my parents to help me pay rent for 6 months and I could pay them back, that was an option. I kind of had the safety net.
But it is an extremely risky thing to do. And it is one of the benefits if you can straddle the grad school transition. It is an advantage
I agree.
for a little bit of money and healthcare and stuff like that.
Totally agree.
Right. And how did you navigate the conflicts of interest associated with that? Or was it kind of, Shelley, I'm going to start with you on that.
I called Kirsten. It was like, whoa, how does this work? And pretty much did everything Kirsten told me to do. I mean,
And I called the equivalent at Berkeley named Michael, and we worked out a very clear plan.
Your Office of Technology and Licensing, or tech transfer, or whatever you call it, you will need to get to know them well. And it's a conflict of interest for you, but if your PI is co-founding or something, the conflict of interest level goes up even further for them, staying on as a professor and owning stock in these things, and prepare for it to take a little while for all the conflict of interest stuff to get nailed down. Start early.
Right.
Like even while you're hatching the idea, start talking to somebody. And I'll say one thing, because I mentor for a couple of different organizations I've run into, is understanding that different universities have different levels of sensitivity around these things. So what happened at Stanford or Berkeley may not be the way that MIT handled it, or whatever or that case may be. There's also this perception that I can start my company and then contract back with my academic lab to do the work, which most universities will not roll with. So you need to have conversations with your tech transfer office if you're even thinking of any of the work continuing within the university.
All great advice. Appreciate that. We're going to move on to discussions around fundraising now, and getting investors, et cetera. So we want to hear about, there's been a lot of questions coming through the chat about fundraising, how you got those first investors, how you did those meetings, et cetera. So I'd love to hear from you about your experiences on fundraising. Laura, I will start with you on this one.
Sure. So our first seed round, as I said, was through a former board member at the place I worked before. So for your really early funding seeds, connections is the way. And this was a connection because I'd worked before, and I really recommend working before grad school to any human being, but it also helps in this regard. Or, you know, if you, one of the things we'll talk about is like, what if I want to find a startup? Well, then go be the 10th employee, be successful, and then that gives you a network if you want to start your own
Totally agree.
later.
Yeah.
So he gave a $50,000 investment with certain criteria. Could we meet these goals? If we did, we get another 200,000. We did that, and that was our seed round. Through their connections and just through like calling, I just pitched. I think we pitched 100 different investors for our Series A, 100 different groups, and 2 said yes.
Yep,
And
that's a
and
hit
we
rate.
listened hard to the rejections, especially the thoughtful rejections. So at first, we had this more complex business model where like, oh, I'll get people to download an app on their phones that they'll love, and then they'll collect data, and then I'll monetize the data in this other way. One of the most important rejections we got, it was not even from a partner, it was from like this guy who's almost a partner who like went to grad school with my friend Dave, who like I got to introduce me on LinkedIn, and just like total cold clawing. He's like, look, I'll tell you this because you're Dave's friends. You just pitched me 2 businesses that have to be mutually successful. That's nearly impossible. Like it's nearly impossible to make one. He's like, you can't have 2 businesses. You can't have a successful app business and a successful data monetization business. That's impossible. You need to decide one or the other. And that was really good rejection because it told me how it could be better. So, and like there were several of those rejection moments over the course of whatever that 8 months of pitching and getting rejection was. That led to an eventual yes.
Yep.
And paying attention to the types of people we rejected and the types of people and the different reasons, and being like, okay, so the people who like us are the people who are like more green oriented or more this oriented. And
yeah. And I'll say that our seed was entirely the networking, this experienced biotech founder that knew my PI really well. Yeah. And for most rounds of funding, once you get a lead, it's easier to get the other money to fall in place. Like who's going to put their hand up first to set the terms on the investment, put the money in. It helped us a lot that this first angel had a lot of credibility in the space. That, friends and family, that would have helped, but having somebody who'd been in biotech that said yes, that really helped. But I will second what Laura said on the kind of hit rate, that I usually say 2%. So there really is a numbers game here. And Rondo is my 4th company I've helped build from the ground up. What was different this time for Rondo, I didn't have to do cold calling, but it was still just as hard past that. Like once I got the warm introductions, it was not any easier. And it is an absolute numbers game. You just have to be willing to get no, 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 no. Learn from the no's and just keep getting back out there. And if you're lucky and it doesn't take that much, like good for you. But it's not most people.
we did the seed A, B, C, D, and each time, because I had more investors and more board members, they will make the warm introductions, or like, so like the cold calling sort of died after the Series B was complete, but it was still, maybe I pitched 60 and got 2 new investors for the Series D instead of 100, but the intros were less awkward.
Yes, agreed. 60 or 80 instead of 100, but it's still a lot.
You guys just answered my next question, which was just about how fundraising is different in each of the rounds. One of the things that I'd like to know from each of you then is, what do you know now about fundraising that you wish you had known then? When you first started this journey. Shelley, I'll start with you on that one.
Kirsten previewed some of these questions and I laughed and I was like, well, I think being naive about it was probably important, or I might not have started. So I'm not actually sure wish I would have known anything else. I think going in passionate and super optimistic was really important. And even though I'm not so naive on these fundraising rounds, like I still go in, passionate and super optimistic. You just kind of have to have that phenotype to do what we do, I think.
Yeah. I think I'm much better at pitching now, like much more concise.
Yes.
But I don't know if that's about fundraising or just pitching anything these days.
Pitching.
I think looking, and I learned this pretty quickly, but don't like read what they say about themselves on the website.
No.
Like we like look at the companies and the CEOs they've invested in previously. Because they all, I mean, everyone's like, we're really different. We like to partner with our entrepreneurs. And you're just like, I don't. So that's all gobbledygook. Like when you're evaluating who might be a good match, look to see if they have companies that have similar storylines to you in their portfolio that have been successful.
Agree. And the thing I'll add to that is one of the questions I love getting, and it just makes me snort every time, is how do I know who I should take money from? Like, who should I prioritize? And I always laugh. I'm like, well, you take money from whoever's going to give you money, and I will buy you a beer and say congratulations if you actually end up having a choice. Because most of us, you take the money where you can get it.
Take it as soon as possible because time kills deals.
And as much as possible.
Yeah.
Don't leave money on the table. I've done that before. I want less dilution. Maybe we won't take all the money they're offering, and take it on the table.
All right. I think we still have more questions on fundraising, but I do want to get to teams because I know that's a huge element of this for building your startup company. As first-time grad student founders, how did each of you build your teams? And there's some sub questions to this, but Laura, I'll start with you, and we'll get to the sub questions later.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing about early teams is you need to balance your own weaknesses. And some of your weaknesses are just like things you're never going to be good at, and some are experiential. So for me, my most important, and my co-founder, like I said, had been in 3 prior startups successfully acquired that all were like kind of data techie oriented. And that was so critical. So it wasn't a group of grad students. Sorry. It was my, I had the passion, I had the industry knowledge, I had the scientific insight on this particular, I mean, you guys got to remember, like, machine learning was like new and cool back then. These new ways of doing things, but in terms of just the process and like the way you read the different type of investor bullshit and all that kind of stuff, Paul was invaluable, and he balanced my weaknesses, and he knew a lot more about building a scalable software, which is very different than writing some really cool code in a lab, having something that can sustain itself. He also brought in a lot of our first technical hires, so he expanded our technical team because he had that network of technical people who were like programmers who were willing to take risks on early stage companies. And several of our most senior developers have been with us the whole time, 14 years still. So that was the most important thing, is to balance your own weaknesses. And then I'm not sure I did a great job with my next couple. I prioritized some things that investors brought up a lot, which I think was fine, like privacy. So we had a very early, very senior legal hire on privacy, data privacy, which is important for us, and I think soothed investors, so maybe it was worth it. And eventually, I think I overhired for experience. Some people like had experience, but I call it like there's this disease, which maybe I have now, where you get so senior that you like can't look at a blank piece of paper and start the first draft of something. You can only edit what somebody else wrote. That's how I encapsulate this disease. And I got too many people that had that disease. So I learned how to find teammates who like will just, they're like, well, this is the goal. This is where we are. Like, I don't care what it takes. I'm just going to get it done. So learning to recognize those types of people, even if they didn't have the perfect experience, once I got over like 2 or 3 people, was the most important hiring. And still is the thing I look for most in hiring.
I fell into a similar trap early with a few people that, experience, but you have to find people who have just enough experience but are still willing to roll up their sleeves and do the dirty work.
Yeah.
But no, you're actually going to have to do that yourself. You're not going to have a consultant. You need to write the draft or whatever it is, which is an interesting line to walk. From my perspective, I had a similar experience to Laura, where we took some of the early money as we were growing the company. It was like, you're 2 grad students, you don't know what you're doing, you should get somebody in with some business experience. Kind of hit our network and brought somebody in who was a little bit older than us, kind of had experience in a different kind of communication startup. It ended up not working for a variety of reasons. I think, we took a good guess at somebody who could be a fit, and it wasn't a fit. So we ended up kind of having to break up like that, which was very hard, but it's what we needed to do. First part of the team was hiring a couple of research assistants, which we did off Craigslist. And then junior scientists, we would like pick people off of grad programs that we knew kind of as they were coming out. So very network oriented, but I would echo Laura's caution about investors like to think you can solve all problems in your startup by hiring really expensive, experienced people. And sometimes they can actually be counterproductive and kind of suck up your burn. I've had more success having people like that as consultants, and then having the FTEs, the full-time equivalent people I brought on, be a little more junior and like willing to roll up their sleeves. Even now when I interview people who think they want to be in a startup, it's like I take out the hazardous waste some days. Like you cannot have too big of an ego. You have to do what needs to be done regardless of kind of level of seniority. So finding that mentality is really important.
And you have to adapt from your experience. Still, I have people like, well, at my prior company, we did it this way. And I'm like, that's an interesting piece of information, but not telling me what we're going to do for us. Like, so
I love
still need to
hiring
be adaptive.
people straight out of grad school because they don't come with, oh, at my other company, we did it this way, which is fine if somebody has a flexibility of thinking, but sometimes it's just easier to get scientists straight out of grad school for me.
How did you each learn people management?
Yeah.
Shelley, I'll start with you.
Trial and error for the most part, 20 years in. I'm a lot better at it, but lots of trial and error. You know, books didn't really speak to me. Every now and then I'd come across one that was somewhat useful. And then talking with board members and other entrepreneurs, just like, hey, I'm up against this challenge. Have you seen it before? How would you handle it? So a lot of just seeking pretty specific advice. It's really hard when anybody comes to you and says, how should I be better about people management? Well, like, what's your particular struggle right now? That's my thought. What about you, Laura?
So I got thrown into people management at my nonprofit job in between school and grad school. And so I was like 25 managing people way over 30, which was a terrible thing that nonprofit should never have done. But it did allow me to make my worst mistakes early and get a little humble about it. So I got to work out my worst mistakes before the startup and knew how much of a challenge it can be to manage people. Basically, managing people who are just like you is fine. They're just you, but a little more junior. Managing people who are not like you is what we say when we say get better at people management. Like if people are similar to you and everything's going well, people management is easy. If people are not similar to you or things are not going well, it is extremely hard. So I would not say it's my greatest skill is direct people management. I learned by doing it and getting really humble about things that I assume about humanity are not universally true. Like one of the things that I still struggle with is how uncomfortable a lot of people are with change. And I'm like, great, we're changing it to this way. And like managing through that is actually a huge process. So the hard way is the only answer. We started to have some like, when it was just 2 or 3 of us, it was fine. When I was managing, like when we got to maybe like 15 people, 17 people, we got an executive team coach to help us be a better team and to help me be a better leader of the team. And that actually was a very worthwhile investment. So and it wasn't like forever. It was like several sessions. Then we could basically, she was our on-call group therapist because she knew all our personalities well. And I was like, Neil is beefing about this again. And she was like, okay, like, let's remember, like Neil likes to think like this and you like to think like this. And so that was very, very worthwhile for me. And now I'm in a position where the people I manage are also executives because I manage like several hundred, my team is several hundred people. And when you're managing other executives, it's totally different. And I recently, just because of some chaos, was managing some like more junior, not like 20 straight out college people, but like, I was like, oh, I've gotten bad at this again. So it is like a muscle you have to constantly keep alive.
Great. This is fantastic. I think it's really helpful.
The brutal failure and an executive coach are my advice.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch to a totally different subject. It's because it's one that comes up a lot, which is about equity and cap tables in the early days of a startup. Can you provide your experience on working with your fellow founders, including your faculty founders, on discussions about equity and cap tables? And Shelley, I will start with you.
So I have very strong opinions. Feel free to take them or leave them. But, I've been part of starting 4 companies myself. I've advised a dozen kind of coming out of academia. So I've seen the same thing play out over and over again. And what I've learned to talk to founders about is you need to think of kind of founders coming into the company, that there's two pools of equity. And I would say the first one is these founder shares. And I suggest thinking about those as dividing them up as to the contribution everybody made up to that point to start the company. And it's like a one-time grant. There's usually not vesting. And then there's the comp packages for people who are actually going to go work at the company. And those are so much more important to kind of burn your energy on, because when you're involved with a company, you will get more stock as you go. When the company raises its additional rounds of funding, you'll often get topped up. The board will give you a little extra stock to kind of keep you engaged. And in the end, and that founder equity will just get continually diluted. So while it feels like a huge thing at the beginning, with very few exceptions, those end up being just tiny slices of the pie when you get to the end. And so, as counterintuitive as it feels, be incredibly generous with your PI or whoever it is with those founder shares, because the reality is they are probably not really going to matter in the end. And I have seen multiple students, postdocs, burn their relationship with their PI and just completely kill their ability to start a company over a couple % of stock that will never matter in the end. And that's just very sad. So as uncomfortable as it is, just be generous with the founder shares and focus on how to get a good comp package for the people who are actually going to be engaging in the company full time.
Yes. A, I disagree with everything she says. Everything is correct. Be so generous. And B, it gets to this other, I think, fundamental truth that the idea of the startup is infinitesimally easier than building a successful business. It almost doesn't matter what the idea is. So if you're giving founder share to attribute for the idea, the odds of just getting to the next milestone are so low. You want everybody pushing in that direction with you. And by the time you've had 4 rounds of financing and the people who weren't engaged after the seed, which was several of my academic collaborators, they just get diluted, right? And then when we sold for a huge amount of money, they get a surprise check for, a nice amount. And some of them were like, but you sold for millions and millions of dollars. I was a founder. I was like, no, this is. So one of them was like a little surprised, and most of them were like, oh my gosh, this chunk of change just showed up for this nice thing I did 10 years ago. That's so exciting. That's what you want.
That's awesome. All right. We're going to talk just briefly about your exit stories. Shelley, I know you already kind of went into yours, and then we're going to do some rapid fire questions because we only have 5 minutes left, and we have still so many questions from the audience. I'm just going to let people know. I think what we might do is, if Laura and Shelley are willing, is answer a lot of these questions in a blog afterwards, because there are so many great questions coming in, but we only have an hour time right now. So we will hopefully get to the answers to your questions in another format. So Laura, your exit story.
So as I said, we'd gone through a seed and ABCD round. It had very big, institutional type investors by that point. I decided at that point for 2 reasons that it was time to look at an exit. 3 reasons. After 6 months after the D. The first was that the buyer market was good and had been good for about a year, and it seemed like it was getting better. And it also seems like that doesn't usually last, which turns out it didn't. So we were geniuses on timing. So one, we were like, this is as good a market as you could sell in. Two, we were seeing, I think Shelley talked about this, the natural end of our total addressable market. We weren't there, but we could start to feel it in the US and Canada, which is where we initially operated. And to go to the next step would have been a big round of investment. Three, we had taken a lot of money. If we were going to make, and then we knew our investors wanted, 5x back on their money or whatever, and 10x back on their money. And if we took another chunk of change we would have had to become a unicorn.
Yeah.
And the odds of that happening and the number of companies that can buy at that level, basically your odds of exit shrink dramatically. If you can get acquired and everyone's happy for 50 mil versus a couple hundred mil versus $1 billion, your likelihood of, and just the option existing shrinks dramatically. So we were like, this might be as good as we get. If we take this other round, it'll be like 3 more years of our lives. We looked at it as leaders, like we get diluted again. So it's not even, so we'd have lower odds of success and we probably wouldn't make much more money. We were just like, this is the natural, and it had been 10 years and I was very tired. And so it seemed like the natural time to make a move. So I brought it up to the board. They were like, we see the components we're talking about. Of course they are. We're like, but you could be a unicorn. Blah, 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 blah. Some of them, not all of them. And we were like, and so they gave me a number and they were like, if you can get above this, we'll say yes. And we'll let you hire a banker. So we said, okay. So we hired a banker and we did a process and we got just above that number. Did it. Also, by that point, the pandemic had started. And it was, I think, more of the investors, especially 2 key ones, were really feeling the potential of recession and tech multiples seizing up. So we're happy to be like, she got the number, let's do it, let's do it, let's do it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Shelley, you already talked to some about your exit before. Anything you wanted to add to that? No.
So
Okay, we're going to go to rapid fire questions. We have 2 minutes left. And I'm going to, before we finish up, I do want to thank our audience for being here. We are going to have a questionnaire that'll come up when you leave. So please answer that. We read all those questionnaires. And I also, of course, I'm very thankful that all of you were here today. So rapid fire questions. Start with you, Shelley. How much, when you were forming the startup companies, how much time were you spending on kind of practical science part of this versus business part of this? And how did you determine what you needed to be spending on that time?
70% business ops, maybe 30% science, and you are just putting out every fire as it arises. I don't think there's much intentionality.
Yeah. All right.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Now I'm down to like 90%, 93% business and 7% stuff.
Yeah. How strategies you have for reaching out to mentors and securing mentors, Laura?
Warm connection is best. Doesn't always mean it's easy. I've also followed up. So I got my best mentors were warm connection. Some people I've worked with have followed up with me after they're like in the industry, like, big transportation event. They like have made a point of coming to a lot of my panels, knowing what I'm talking about. Like, they know that they're in line with what I think about.
I would say don't just ask people to be your mentor.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a big commitment. I don't know you. Just say, could we have coffee or a Zoom sometime?
Yeah.
Build a relationship. You don't actually have to ask someone to be your mentor. It will probably scare them off.
Yeah. Like yesterday, I just took a Zoom coffee with this younger startup and they were like, we just know you got bought by an AEC and we have questions about the business model of AEC. So I was like, I can answer questions about the business models of AECs. But then they're like, can we follow up with you in a few months about this? And I'm like, okay, they're courting. That's good. But it was specific. It wasn't like mentor me.
Yes.
We're just about at time. I'm going to ask you one question about challenges. What was a challenge you did not expect in doing a startup as a grad student, and how did you overcome that challenge? Shelley, I'll start with you.
It's a challenge every day. You don't see half of them coming. So I'm not sure that would change. You have to like walking into your office or your lab and knowing that some random thing is going to pop and you're going to have to deal with it. That has not changed in 20 years.
Yeah, it was all about removing my ego. from rejection to failure to just, that might be a challenge for everyone going through their 20s who makes it out productively, but that was the challenge for me too, when I was in my 20s.
That's great. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time, all the prep time that we had preparing for this. And I know everyone really enjoyed your responses today. We'll find them useful in building hopefully their own startup companies. And as I mentioned, we'll follow up with you because there were still a lot of outstanding questions that we had from the audience. Obviously, a lot of people interested in this particular topic and interested in doing this themselves, which is fantastic to see that we have a lot more motivated people to build these startups out of academia. So thank you both so much for being here today. Really appreciate your time.